The time I was hunted. Back in 1998, I was a pretty broke 19-year-old guy and living with a roommate named Steve. Steve was about my age, maybe a year older. His dad had died a few years prior and had left Steve a trust fund which covered all his bills and gave him a weekly allowance on top of it, until he reached a certain age, at which time he'd receive his full inheritance. Steve and I got along pretty well, but he was the kind of guy who liked to remind you if he had some degree of power over you. That aspect of his personality butted up against my own stubborn, prove the world wrong attitude on a particular night led to the events I'm about to describe. Steve and I went over to my friend Trevor's house on Siesta Key one night. Steve drove, as I didn't have a car. I don't remember why we went over there, and I don't even know that I really remember any other instance of the three of us hanging out. I just know that we went there late in the evening, maybe 9 or so. At some point, Steve and I got in a disagreement over something. I have no memory of what it was about, except that I seem to recall that it wasn't anything important that actually impacted our lives in any way. Something akin to disagreeing over a bit of movie trivia or something as inconsequential as that. Steve must have felt that he was losing the debate, because he took the opportunity to remind me that he had the car and I could always walk home. Now, there are a few things to note here. First, home would be a 13-mile walk. I could not have told you that at the time, but I just looked it up for this telling. Second, we were at my best friend's house. I'd stayed over there countless times and absolutely could have that night. Third, my best friend also had a car and would likely have given me a ride. So Steve's threat was completely empty, whether he realized it or not. But what was important to me at that moment was that Steve, the trust fund brat, wanted to exert control over me because his ego was bruised. And I was a stubborn hothead who would absolutely not stand for that shit. So I silently decided that I would walk home, just to spite him and to show him that I wouldn't be intimidated. So a bit later, under the pretense of going to use the restroom, I left the room and quietly left the house and started the 13-mile walk home. I should note that while I knew this was a long walk, I didn't quite understand how long it was. But it didn't matter. I needed to prove my independence. It was probably 11 p.m. or so when I left the house. I anticipated that they'd come looking for me when they discovered that I had left. So I tried to stay off the main path as best I could, determined to make the whole walk in order to make my point. This may be a good place to remind you that this is 1998 and a good 2 or 3 years before I got my first cell phone. The first hour and a half went by without incident. I made my way all the way to downtown Sarasota. The more direct route would have been to follow the main road along the waterfront, but I cut through downtown, still looking to avoid Steve spotting me on his way back home. This is an area I was super comfortable with. I'd spent most of my childhood in the area, and especially in my teen years, had explored every nook and cranny of the downtown area. It was also a pretty affluent area, full of high-rise condos that look out over the Gulf of Mexico and known for theatre, opera, and art galleries. As such, even past midnight, it didn't feel menacing at all, just quiet and empty. The path I'd chosen through downtown went along Pineapple Avenue, which was mostly art galleries and upscale shops. As I walked along, I saw a red hatchback sitting in the middle of the road, just a little way past an intersection up ahead of me. I noticed it had no license plates, but didn't think too much of it. I figured it was a tag applied for kind of situation. As I got nearer, the car remained stopped. The interior light was on, and I could see there were 3 or 4 guys in there. The interior light being on made me assume they were looking at a map or something, though I couldn't make out the inside of the car well enough to see anything more than the general shapes of people. As I crossed a small intersection, maybe 30 or 40 feet away from the car now, I suddenly got a really uneasy feeling. I don't know if the car was still for just too long, or the figures inside too still, or what. I just suddenly got to feeling very ill at ease. So instead of continuing on, I casually turned down the left side street, and as soon as the corner of the building blocked me from their view, I bolted. This was a spot where a small access road ran behind these buildings and then connected to an alley, and then another very thin alley that ran alongside a church and ended back on Pineapple Avenue, right where the red car was. I ran this sequence of alleys and popped out just in time to see the rear end of the car vanish down the side street I'd run down. At this point, I wasn't scared at all. I had the idea that the guys in that car had something unpleasant in mind for me, but I knew damn well that I'd given them the shake. There's no way in hell that they'd expect me to be back where they started. If they were looking for me, it was going to be elsewhere. So I continued along, feeling smug. After 10 or 15 minutes, I pretty much had to get out on the main road, because the alternative was walking through a seedy neighborhood that I wasn't nearly as confident about as I was downtown. As I approached the first big intersection along that main road, I saw the red car again up ahead, noticeably by the lack of license plates. I kinda grinned to myself about having foiled them. On this big road, there were some other cars here, and even at this late hour, so I felt less isolated and more at ease. Until I saw the car slow to a crawl, despite not being anywhere near the light yet. Suddenly, I found myself wondering if they might have spotted me again, so I decided to just cross to the other side of the street. It's a US highway, so it's several lanes wide, with a median down the center. Being on the other side would put me a fair distance from them, but when I got to the other side, that's when I realized I was in actual danger. This red hatchback suddenly sped up, racing to the intersection ahead and zipped over into the left lane, where it banged a tire-screeching U-turn to head back in my direction. Where I'd crossed was a nice green space between the History Center and the Garden Club, where a gigantic tree stood. I think it was a banyan, but I could be mistaken. On the other side of that green space was a parking lot, some buildings, and the bay. I wasn't familiar enough with what was back there to be able to pull a trick like I had before, so I climbed. I got as high into the tree as I could, as fast as I could. I always dressed in all black then, so I was pretty confident I'd be nearly impossible to spot, as long as they didn't actually climb up after me. So I got up and nestled into the most hidden spot I could, and tried not to make any noise at all. Hiding up in the tree, I was so surrounded by foliage that I couldn't see what was going on. On the plus side, that meant that they were really unlikely to see me. On the other hand, I didn't know what to prepare myself for. So I sat up there, running through scenarios in my head, trying to plan my next move. Even if I hadn't been outnumbered, flight was really my only option. As speedy and scrappy as I was, at 5'3", no fight I put up was likely to do much good. As I sat on that branch, trying to plan my next move, my blood ran cold. Any remaining doubt about what was happening, any fleeting hope that I was just being paranoid, flew out the window as I heard car doors open and close, heard footsteps in the grass, and eventually an angry male voice say, "Where is this motherfucker?" Followed by a "Look over there, I'll check this area." It was official. I was being hunted. I don't know how long I stayed up that tree. It can't have been more than 10 minutes, and more likely it was quite a bit less than that. But it felt like forever. At some point, I decided to risk another flight, though I can't remember what triggered it. Car doors, the car driving away, I just can't remember. I do remember jumping from the tree and landing with a hard thud, and bolting back the way I'd come as fast as I could, terrified that whatever sound made me feel like it was safe to come out of hiding had been a ploy to draw me out. At the intersection where they had made the U-turn was a 24-hour gas station, of course, across both roads. All I could think was that if I could make it inside, it would be safe and I could call the police. That run is a total blur, but I remember going through the door I remember the look on the clerk's face as she saw my panicked expression. I called the police and explained what happened, and I waited inside for them to arrive. When they got there, I went out front to meet them and explained everything to the only officer who actually spoke to me. He was not sympathetic. I had described the car in detail, as well as all the events, and he said that they probably thought I was a male prostitute and were trying to pick me up. I thought to ask him if prostitutes get a lot of business by fleeing from prospective Johns and hiding in trees, but I was distracted by the sight of the red hatchback slowly cruising by, watching me talk to the police. I pointed to the car and exclaimed that was the car. The police seemed entirely uninterested. He glanced at the car for half a second and looked back at me and said, "What do you want me to do about it?" "I don't want to walk anymore," I exclaimed. I'm sure there were better ways I could have articulated that there were people attempting to capture me for unknown nefarious purposes, and that I was in fear of my life should they encounter me on the street again, but "I don't want to walk anymore" was all I was capable of in that moment. The cop pointed to the side of the police car and said, "You see what it says there? It says police, not taxi." His condescending attitude was doing a great job to replace my fear with some of the brash attitude that had gotten me into the situation in the first place. So I replied, "It also says to serve and protect, and I'm asking you to protect me because I think I'm in danger." He gave a sigh, like a teenager asked to do the dishes, and told me that he can't take me all the way, because I lived in the next town and county over, but that he'd take me to the county line, which is another major intersection along that same main highway. That was still a good 5.5 miles from my house. Again, a number I just looked up for this telling, but got me off the road for almost 3 miles and made it less likely these people would find me again. The cops dropped me off in front of the museum and I walked another 2 hours or so, looking over my shoulder constantly, ready to run down side streets or jump into bushes if need be. My girlfriend's house was slightly closer than my own, and with the sun now rising, I knew she'd be okay with me stopping in. In the end, I made it safely and never saw that red car again. Almost 30 years later, I still sometimes wonder what might have become of me if they had gotten their hands on me. The determination they showed in pursuing me leads me to believe that nothing I can imagine, no matter how bad, is outside the realm of possibility. So, hunting party in the red hatchback, let's not meet. Someone entered my hotel room while I was in it. This is a completely true story and just happened an hour ago. Wanted to talk about it somewhere, and the only place I could think of was surprisingly this subreddit. For context, my wife and I are on vacation in Mexico. We both honestly are loving it here, and the situation doesn't change that, but I am re-evaluating security. My wife and I went out to dinner and walked back to our hotel. We get inside our room, are setting things down, etc. A few minutes go by, and there's a knock at the door. A man quietly says something in Spanish in an inflection that's trying to get our attention. Think room service or something. My wife looks at me like wondering who would be at the door. At this point, I should clarify that we had the "Do Not Disturb" tag on the door. A few seconds go by and there's another knock at the door. My wife signals for me to go to the door, so I go over. At this point, we've made no sounds for probably a minute before and during the knocks. Just as I reached the door, the key card unlocked the door and it opened. A dirty-looking man had just opened the door and is about 2 feet from my face. I put my hand on the door to prevent it opening any further. I think he was as surprised as I was. He starts speaking Spanish and I hear the word Wi-Fi somewhere in there. I say, "No hablo español." In broken English, she tries to ask if the Wi-Fi is down. My wife says it's not. I'm just kind of shell-shocked by what just happened and keep my hand on the door as he talks and eventually leaves. I shut the door and engaged the physical lock this time. I usually do this, but we had just walked in and wanted to set stuff down. I talk with my wife as we try to gather our thoughts about what just happened. Essentially, a man knocked, got no reply, then let himself in and asks about Wi-Fi. No, this was a clear burglary attempt and he has a master key card and thought we weren't home. A minute or two later, after this went down and we've collected ourselves and understood what just occurred, I passed this information to the front desk in case this guy attempts other doors. They seem to take it seriously. No updates beyond that. The fact this just happened has my mind kind of blown, and I don't know if I've fully processed it yet. Like, what if we were back 30 minutes later? Probably would have lost some stuff. 5 minutes later, we walk in on a guy in our hotel room. What if we went to bed earlier tonight? Could have been asleep, the AC is loud, and I don't know if I would have heard the door knocking through my sleep. If it was going to go down, surely the way it did was optimal. But those ifs are crazy. I'll definitely be storing our valuables in the safe now. Should have done this too, but we just recently got here. Lesson learned. In the future, stuff is going immediately into the safe and the lock is getting immediately engaged. Psycho in a thrift store. I had a creepy encounter in a charity shop selling secondhand clothes and whatnot. 20 years ago, I was in my early 20s at university and wasn't a shy or nervous person at all, but this experience haunted me. The man did nothing wrong, but I got the strongest creep vibes I've ever felt. So I go in to browse. It's quite busy in there, and whilst looking around, I spotted a man who worked there. It actually felt like he spotted me and would keep looking over, etc. I instantly felt very uncomfortable. I mean, this guy who looked very normal made my blood run cold and really frightened me. I tried to avoid his gaze, but something unsettled me in a way that has never happened to me before or since. A real strange danger feeling that I wasn't used to, especially from a shop assistant. He then came over and asked if I needed any help, and a weird instinct kicked in to get the hell away from this man and fast. I said no thank you and quickly left the shop. I literally wanted to run. I was so surprised by the terror this man's presence caused me to feel. Like I said, I was quite a confident young woman, not easily spooked by people at all, but he terrified me, just a feeling I got. Throughout my life, I've had my fair share of creepy guys who have been interested in me and displayed that in a weird way and never been freaked out by it, but there was something so incredibly off about him. Despite this, there were a pair of jeans I liked in there, so I made my boyfriend come with me the following days as there was no way I was going to use the fitting room on my own with that creep in there. We went in, he was there. Nothing happened and I tried on the jeans, didn't like them and left. I didn't think any more about it other than I won't be going back there again. A couple of days later, my parents visited and we were sitting having breakfast in a cafe. My dad was reading the local paper and he said, "Look at this." He turned the paper to me and there was a photo of a man who 100% happened to be the creepy man from the shop. The article was about how he had just been released from prison for stabbing his girlfriend like 14 times or something. After an incredibly short sentence, he was allowed to live and work in the same town this poor victim and her family are from, and was even given a job to help him resettle into society or whatever. It really did stay with me. I was horrified that I'd interacted with this man, but knew at that point to always trust my instincts, because they were screaming at me to get away from him. Something my neighbour said still haunts me. Even though this was almost 10 years ago now, I've never been able to get this out of my head, so I thought I'd post it here. I was about 11 or 12 years old, living in an apartment with my mom. Right across from our apartment was a very creepy neighbour. I could write a whole book about all the creepy, wild, and downright insane things he said and did throughout the 2 years that he was our neighbour, but this was something that stuck with me more than anything else. My mom and this neighbour were having a casual conversation with each other, with my mom's goal being to try to find some common ground with him, and clear up any misunderstandings or miscommunications that may have led him to dislike us so much, as he had a pretty blatant feeling of disdain towards us. But evidently, something went wrong during this conversation, as my mom suddenly came stomping into our apartment, loudly shutting and locking the door. She was visibly upset and shaken, so I asked what's wrong. Her voice trembling, she said that our neighbour said this, completely unprompted. You know, if I were you, I'd keep your daughter away from guys like me. Now, while I will never know exactly what he meant by this, my mind definitely had plenty of ideas of what the fuck he meant by this. At the very least, it felt like a thinly veiled threat. And the worst part was that I was often home alone, as I did online school while my mom went to work. So from then on, I never felt safe when I was home alone, as my imagination ran wild on what he might end up doing to me. Now, I never thought I would say this kind of thing, and I feel a little guilty about it, but thankfully he ended up dying before he ever did follow through on his creepy-ass comment. Also, before anyone asks, my mom only told me about this because she wanted to warn me to stay away from him, and to never do anything like keep the door unlocked. She didn't have to tell me twice. I hiked through a Scottish ghost town at night. I wasn't alone. For the past 2.5 years now, I've been living in the north of the Scottish Highlands, and when I say north, I mean as far north as you can possibly go. I live in a small coastal town, which is actually the northernmost town on the British mainland. I had always wanted to live in the Scottish Highlands, which seemed a far cry from my gloomy hometown back in England, and when my dad and his partner told me they'd bought an old house up here, I jumped at the opportunity. From what they told me, this place sounded like the perfect destination. There were seals and otters in the town's river, dolphins and orcas in the sea, and at certain times of the year, you could see the northern lights in the night sky. But despite my initial excitement of finally getting to live in the Scottish Highlands, full of beautiful mountains, amazing wildlife, and vibrant culture, I would soon learn the region I had just moved to was far from the idyllic destination I had dreamed of. In my spare time, I took to exploring the coastline around the town's area. On one of these days, I started to explore what was east of the town. On the right-hand side of the mouth of the river, there's an old ruin of a castle, but past that leads to a cliff trail around the eastern coastline. 6 or so months later, and into the Christmas season, I'd just gotten out of a long-distance relationship. Feeling as though I had finally found closure, I decided I wanted to go on a long hike by myself along the cliff trail. And so, the day after Christmas, Boxing Day, I got my backpack together, packed a lunch for myself, and headed out at 6 a.m. The hike along the trail had taken me all day, and by the evening I had walked so far that I actually discovered what I first thought was a ghost town. What I found was an abandoned port settlement, which had the creepiest looking disperse of old stone houses, as well as what looked like the ruins of an ancient round tower. As it turned out, this was actually a heritage centre, a tourist spot. It seemed I had walked so far around the rugged terrain that I was now 10 miles outside of my town. On the other side of the settlement were very high, distant cliffs, which, compared to the cliffs I had already trekked along, were far grander. Although I could feel my legs finally begin to give way, and already anticipating a long journey back along the trail, I decided I was going to cross the bay and reach the cliffs, and then make my way back home. By the time I was making my way around the bay, it had become very dark. I had already walked past more than half of the bay, but the cliffs didn't feel any closer. It was at this point when I decided I really needed to turn around, as at night, walking back along the cliff trail was going to be dangerous, and for the parts of the trail that led down to the base of the cliffs, I really couldn't afford for the tide to cut off my route. I made my way back through the abandoned settlement of the Heritage Centre, and at night this place definitely felt more like a ghost town. Shining my phone flashlight in the windows of the old stone houses, I was expecting to see a face or something peer out at me. What surprisingly made these houses scarier at night were a handful of old fishing boats that had been left outside them. The wood they were made from looked very old, and the paint had mostly been weathered off. But what was more concerning was that in this abandoned ghost town of a settlement, I wasn't alone. A van had pulled up, with 3 or 4 young men getting out. I wasn't sure what they were doing exactly, but they were burning things into a trash can. What it was they were burning, I didn't know, but as I made my way out of the abandoned settlement, every time I looked back at the men by the van, at least one of them were watching me. Already feeling scared of the creepy surroundings, I now felt very unsafe because of these men, staring suspiciously at me. I was paranoid that they were going to try and follow me, as if I had caught them doing something illegal. Thankfully, they stayed where they were, as I continued to make my way out the ghost town and back along the trail. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching and listening. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to hit like. And if you'd like to see more of this content in future, don't forget to hit subscribe. If you have any creepy stories you'd like to share with me, please don't hesitate to do it in the comments down below. I love reading them. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next week.